Hello, Fiona, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we had beforehand. I also just want to acknowledge the young researchers who are listening on NewMR today. We're so privileged to be sponsoring your competition, but it's just inspiring to hear what all of you are saying. So let me tell you a little bit about what I want to talk about today. Clearly, it's no surprise to anyone that social media is such a disruptive trend in market research, both as a methodology and as a source of insights. And in this new world, we have an opportunity to get to know consumers by watching them do life and engaging with them, whether we're monitoring them via online tools, whether we're engaging them in conversation via communities. We're learning not only what they think of us and our brands, but also more about their lives, their dreams, their frustrations. So as Fiona had mentioned, we have been working with clients and engaging with online communities for insights since November of 2000, when we launched our first community with Hallmark, the U.S. greeting card company. And in the last 11 years, I would say that we have written more papers and more articles about best practices and how you really make communities work. They're on our website. They're in every potential publication. We've covered everything from what our experience is with incentives, to whether people should know what your brand is, to how you do the right kind of facilitation. So that is not what I'm going to talk about today. Instead, given all of our experience, I always tell people that we have made more mistakes than anyone else. And today I'm going to tell you more specifically what I mean by that, and share some of the results of the research we have done into what goes wrong. Not just what our clients have asked us to do that hasn't worked, but what we have done that we thought would work and that just exploded in our faces in a negative way. So I also think that you might agree, even if you're not interested in communities, I think some of these experiences have implications for research overall, and not just for what is going on in online communities. So for those of you who aren't familiar with communities, let me just give you a sense of what we're talking about here. I want to make sure I can move my slides. Well, I don't know if we've got anybody on the line there, but it looks like the slides aren't moving. So I'm going to...
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Hi, Dan. If you just move to the center of the screen and click, you should be able to take control.
Okay.
There we go.
Ah, there we go. The magic of technology. Thank you. Okay, so rather than giving you a bunch of cases, if you would rather understand a lot about cases, about communities via looking at specific client cases, you can go to our website, which is communispace.com, and look at those. But to save us some time, let me just give you the general model. Think about a community, or at least the way I'm talking about it today, essentially as a focus group on steroids. As instead of 10 people sitting in a room for an hour, through the magic of the internet, you can think of a community as a room filled with consumers who are essentially in there all the time, or at least available to brands whenever and wherever they need insight and feedback. So the reason you've got a triangle up here is that a community that's really working and really vibrant for the client essentially has 3 channels of communication. On the right-hand side, if you have all of these people in a room for an hour, you can, for not an hour, but for all of the time, you can ask them questions. That can be traditional things like surveys or discussion boards. You can also ask them to leave the room and go mystery shopping, to brainstorm ideas, to take photographs, to create videos, or lots of other things that we'll get into in a moment. On the left-hand side, if you have all those consumers in a room, they will give you unsolicited advice. They will give you the answers to the questions that you forgot to ask on an ongoing basis, because they begin to care about the relationship And of course, on the bottom, if your community is really vibrant, you also have the opportunity to get insight by listening in on what people are actually saying to each other. And the magic of the community is these 3 channels. In our typical community, you would be engaged in 2 to 3 different activities or research projects during a typical week. And in return for that, because they're building relationships with each other and with you, there's an opportunity to hear things that you might not hear as quickly or as deeply as you would with traditional research. So that's the good news. Let me give you 5 things that actually haven't worked over the years for us, and perhaps when we get to the question and answer session, you might even have a way to share some of your experiences with me, or if not, you can always email me at dhessan@communispace.com. Twitter is Communispace CEO. I'm always interested in other people's experiences and stories. So here are the 5. Number 1 is what we call the bigger is better syndrome. Oops, now I'm going backwards here. Okay, the bigger is better syndrome. One big mistake we have made over the years is to focus on the wrong metric, and that is that we have been trying to increase over time the number of members in the community. The perfect size for us, having done about 600 of these, is about 300 to 500 members. Now 300 to 500 people sounds small, but actually the metric that matters is what we call engagement or participation. So if you have a community of 300 to 500 people and 3 people are participating, the 3 is the problem, not the 300 to 500. So what we're looking at is to what extent are people actually engaged and participating and creating content. And what we found is that if the community is too big, participation actually goes down. Now, the first people who started looking at this are Jackie Huba and Ben McConnell, who have a blog called Church of the Customer. They operate out of Austin, Texas in the U.S., and they are credited with first looking at online participation. And they came up with a concept called the 10% rule. So in essence, if you have an online community, only 10% will participate, they say. And specifically, the way that breaks down is that 1% will actually create content, and an additional 9% will lurk, meaning that they'll come onto the site and read, but not really do much more than respond to the occasional one-question poll. Now, if you're a researcher and you can only get 1% to participate, this is death, or at least this is extremely expensive. And that's why, as researchers, we frequently need to recruit huge numbers of people just to get a valid sample size. So the lesson we have is in our communities, they're small, but participation is actually high. So if you look on the right-hand side of this chart, we tend to use what we've come up with is what we call the 64% rule. So literally in a community that is small with 300 to 500 members, we have a very, very low lurker rate, but participation rates, 64% of those people will actually come in and create content. That 7.3 contributions per member is actually each month. We see very low variability in these numbers between B2B and B2C applications, or among different industry verticals, or different demographics. So smaller can increase engagement. Let's contrast that with something like Facebook. There's a social marketing company called Visibly that recently studied Facebook fan pages that had at least 100,000 likes. And what they found was that for every 100,000 people who like a fan page, on average, only 54% will like, only 54 people will like a given post, and only 9 will actually comment. Not 9%, but 9 people. So what you're talking about is very, very large numbers required in order to get a very small number of people to content. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't mine Facebook data, but it does mean that if you are trying to get insight or feedback, you can get it faster and more in-depth if you keep your numbers small. So the net is the holy grail of communities for insight is often intimacy. We're in the midst of researching this more, and I'll probably have more to participate in this, but one client said to me a couple of weeks ago, I have 1 million, I have 5 million, I have 55,000 panelists. It's almost like a men's room conversation, and yet that is the metric that tends not to matter. So for us anyway, we found that engagement does trump sample size. The second problem, the second misuse, is what I call surveyitis. Clients and we have wanted to use our communities like a traditional panel and just constantly survey people and not vary or mix things up. So if, as I mentioned before, if one of our typical communities has 2 to 3 activities per week, we have over the years had communities where we have just surveyed people in the interest of being able to quantify results. The response on this is that members have said that this is just downright boring. And over time, we've also done some research on this that says that as you increase the variety of activities, again, you increase participation. We did a study earlier this year in 57 of our communities, and we essentially found that those with more balanced facilitation, such as maybe 1/3 surveys, 1/3 discussions, 1/3 other activity types, generated a much higher number of average monthly contributions than those that were dominated by surveys. You had about 25% higher participation. So until 2009, I would say that at least at Communispace, the preponderance of what we were doing in our communities was just discussion boards and surveys, and we have changed that, and both the quality and frequency of insights has skyrocketed. There are so many examples of what you can do above and beyond typical research. We've had tremendous success with mobile ethnography, which has been a marvelous way for us to be able to capture insights from consumers in context. Here's a photograph of a really interesting display that I have just seen while I'm out shopping, and so on. Or lots of other examples. Heat mapping's been really successful for us. Consumers love clicking around and giving us indications of what they're reading. Lots of other techniques, collaging, whiteboarding, video chats, so many different ways to track what's going on. Here's something that's actually worked in the U.S., although it has not worked as much outside because people don't know this game called Mad Libs, but it's essentially a fill-in-the-blanks exercise that helps us keep a pulse on how people's lives are changing. Even finding ways for people to actually submit diagrams. This is, I can't give you all of the details of this, but this is actually a submission from a member about a suggestion for a product package that had a tremendous impact on this brand's ability to to increase usage and attractiveness of their packaging. So, I'm not going to go through this chart in depth, but the net here is that what we found is that by using less researchy approaches and more humanistic, transparent approaches, success has gone up. Put another way, the notion of treating consumers as people as opposed to respondents, by leveraging emerging technologies that foster connection, you simply avoid the pitfalls of barging into people's lives, and instead you meet them where they are. And of course, there can be huge efficiencies and cost savings to be accrued if you can capture a high volume of open-ended data at a low cost. So that's number 2. Number 3 is what I call the garbage pail, or sometimes what I call the calculator effect. So I don't know about you, but do you find yourself sometimes you pull your calculator out and you find yourself punching in 2 + 2 and waiting for the answer? I do that. I find that I get so used to using my calculator that I do things on it that are not worthwhile. And I know that over the years we have found sometimes that if you have an online community and it's there as an asset, sometimes the temptation is to use it for everything, including research that people don't have budgets for, the what do you want, red versus green, do you want 16 grams versus 18 grams or whatever. And the community becomes a repository of unimportant tactical input that just gives you superficial information. Just not a good way of using things. Here's one model that we use to get out of that. The key thing to look at here is the right and left. On the right, you can think of activities that you might engage with consumers in called feedback. What do you think of this? What do you think of this ad? What do you think of this package? What do you think of this word? What do you think of this product idea? And so on, to really learn how consumers perceive us. That's one set of activities that you can engage in. The other side is discovery, which helps us deepen our understanding of consumers and who they are. So to do this, you're looking to uncover unmet needs, potentially find competitive white spaces, or dive more deeply into consumer emotions. And both of these work well. What we found is that the ideal mix is about 50-50. And if you've just spent all of your time on the feedback side, which is your temptation, sometimes it's fun for consumers, but you tend to essentially learn things that reinforce what you already know. So the question becomes, how do you resist the temptation to put everything in the community, and how do you increase the amount of real estate that you have devoted to discovery? Another metaphor I use, my favorite American candy is a Tootsie Pop. I don't know if you know what this is, but the outside is hard candy and the inside is chocolate and chewy. So the notion here is that you don't want to use a community, or in fact any research in the 21st century, to just kind of get you that superficial outside. That if you're going to have a continuous connection to consumers and you can build trust online, then you have an opportunity to get that chewy center that's so full of taste and texture. Okay, number 4, the Trojan Horse. For many of us, this is an ethical issue, but sometimes people want to use the community to listen to consumers, but as we think about it, the real agenda is sometimes that people want to create advocates. This is a Trojan horse problem. And, you know, in 2011, consumers are smart. They know if you are pretending to listen to them, as opposed to really genuinely wanting to know what they think. The notion of going in and pretending to listen to people just so that then they will go out and buzz about you, I will tell you that that has never, ever worked for us. We have lots of specific situations that I can share with you, and I don't have a lot of time here. Here's a contrast with 2 different communities we created several years ago for a division of GSK that was promoting Ally, a weight loss drug. We had one community, the one on the left, where in essence people had been working with the Ally brand team for years, helping them create a product, all the educational materials around it, how it was going to be rolled out. We had a second community on the right that got created of bloggers, of women bloggers, where we were getting a little bit of input from them, but seeing whether they were also interested in going out and advocating. I will tell you that organically, the community on the left, people were very interested in an opportunity to talk to their friends about something where they were involved in co-creation. On the right-hand side, there was absolutely no one in this blogging community who felt any affinity to the brand, who really thought that they were part of the creation. And although therefore lots of people will say, gee, if you get a bunch of bloggers together and ask them questions, they'll go out and say great things about you, I will tell you we've never had the experience of that working. The last one is what hasn't worked with communities and with much social media for us is using a traditional research mindset. So when I was in school, what I learned about in research was the value of anonymity, people not knowing who you are, of keeping things structured, of creating ad hoc projects when they were appropriate. A client of ours once told me a story about how she was using this. She was in a focus group. She and her colleagues were sitting behind the mirror listening to the focus group, and by mistake, one of her colleagues leaned over and the light where the clients were sitting went on in the room, and all of a sudden, all of the consumers in the focus group could see them. So what did they do? They literally jumped to the floor and were lying down on the floor so that they could be invisible to the consumers. And I think that's such an interesting visual. And yet it's not the sort of thing that works when you're talking about online communities, and in fact, a lot of research these days. So the things that work are when you're open, when people know who you are, who your brand is, what you're trying to accomplish, what the issues are, where there are problems, and when research works more as a conversation. So let me just end, because I want to make sure we have some time, with a quotation from Stan Steinernathan, who's one of our clients at Coca-Cola. We are focusing our time on the technicalities of research, whereas the expectation from clients is actually in a totally different space. Clients are saying, inspire me, help me to take some transformational action. That doesn't always happen. There are lots of mistakes that we have made over time. But of course, a lot of the trick for the future is to learn from those and move forward. So I'm expecting that we will have lots of other themes around this to report over time, but those are the big ones that came out of our research for now.